Weldon also joined peace delegations in Nicaragua earlier, 1984 and 1990, and Russia, 1988. Weldon grew up on a farm in Iowa. He did political organizing from 1968 to 73, while also earning a BBA from the University of Iowa in economics and political science from 1966 to 72. A lifelong Mennonite, he earned his MA in peace studies, basing his master thesis on liberation theology after studying in Columbia in 1977. He became a Benedictine Oblate in 2001, affiliated with St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, where he was a resident scholar at the Collegeville Institute in 2001, 2007, 2010, and 2015. Weldon has had many articles published in many places that amplify the voices of people targeted by war and political oppression. These include the Seattle Times, the Mennonite, Common Dreams, and other publications. We are very happy to welcome Weldon Nisly to FOR tonight to share his observations with us and to join us in a Q&A after half an hour, whatever, presentation. So take it away, Weldon.
Thank you so much. Here, let me get set up here. Okay, are you seeing that title?
Machines can
Okay.
do. Is there a point in comparing AI to human intelligence?
Okay. I have about, if you're talking with Mary Margaret, and thanks to Mary Margaret and all of you, I have about 40 minutes. If that, we're going to cover a lot of territory. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. It'll go pretty quickly. But Zorspas, thank you very much in Kurdish for inviting me to share voices and views from Iraqi Kurdistan with you. In honor of Martin Luther King's, what would be his 94th birthday, I want to start with a prophetic truth of Kings. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence. In this world, it is nonviolence or non-existence. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. So with that introduction, I will introduce CPT because I don't know how much you know about CPT briefly, and then Iraqi Kurdistan briefly before introducing you to our beloved Kurdish partners who know the violence of endless war. Seared on my heart forever is the haunting cry of a young Kurdish mother fleeing war and genocide along with others across the mountain on foot in winter. High on a mountain, snow-covered mountain, she cried out to a lone television reporter from the UK. She said, "Why? What did we do? We are human too, just like you." Her cry to that journalist that day is a cry to the world every day. In the mid-1980s, Christian Peacemaker Teams was envisioned by Mennonites and founded by historic peace churches and a few other peace groups. CPT's original mission was getting in the way, as in getting in the way of war, by being a nonviolent presence, confronting war in solidarity with local people who were impacted by war. The US used, as we know so well, September 11, 2001 as an excuse to lie our way into endless war. In March 2003, the Bush administration manipulated the coalition of the willing into joining the invasion of Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. So from 2002 to 2006, CPT was based in Baghdad, getting in the way of war by accompanying people targeted by war and documenting war crimes. I was there with the team in March of 2003 in the early days of the war. That's another long story. It is also, as we would say, those of us who are Christian, is getting in the way of Jesus, as in following the way of Jesus. Solidarity with civilians targeted by war, though, led CPT to a new mission. We learned that getting in the way of war imposed white Western Christian answers on people who know better than we do what builds peace in their life and land. CPT's mission then became building partnerships to transform violence and oppression by accompanying people targeted by war and oppression, by advocating with them for their freedom, rights, and peace, and by amplifying their voices at home and around the world. Nonviolent, peaceful presence also led CPT to a new name. A year ago, right now, this week, Christian Peacemaker Teams was transformed into Community Peacemaker Teams. We're still CPT in name and vision and known as CPT around the world, while continuing our commitment to nonviolent peace, truth, and love. We are now an interfaith, international community whose vision is a world of communities that together embrace the diversity of the human family and live justly and peaceably with all creation. Now, a little bit on just introducing Kurdistan. The Kurdish homeland covers a four-nation geographical region encompassing northern Syria, eastern Turkey, western Iran, and northern Iraq in this sort of gold, orange, reddish area here. 40 to 50 million Kurds live in this region as they have for centuries. They are the world's largest ethnic group without a nation state. The Kurdistan region of Iraq, the KRI, is a semi-autonomous region of northern Iraq. It functions very much like a state does in relation to the US. It uses Iraqi currency and Iraqi passports, but has its own prime minister and parliament and ministries and functions somewhat autonomously. The CPT Iraqi Kurdistan has lived in Suleimani here in this region and since 2006. However, we travel across the Kurdistan region of Iraq. CPT is the only international human rights entity documenting Turkey and Iran's war on Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan. So we try this green, gold, purple, brown area. We travel all the way up across from the Syrian border to Turkey border to the Iranian border, doing our work. Our first priority is with people impacted by Turkey and Iran's military invasion. The village of Harure here is a farming region near the border with Turkey and relatively close to Syria as well. Turkish warplanes, helicopter gunships, and drones frequently bombard this area. Turkey continues building roads and bases further and further inside Iraq in this region. Military bases occupy mountaintops for surveillance and shelling. That's circled in the red. Most of them are small outposts on mountaintops around for surveillance and shelling. Turkey justifies their war by calling it a war on terror against Kurdish resistance. PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, is a militant political organization with an armed guerrilla movement who fight for freedom from Turkey and Iran's oppression of Kurds. The US and European Union joined Turkey designating PKK as terrorists. It's a ridiculous designation. CPT, I want to be clear, CPT does not support PKK or any armed group. We do not meet with anyone with weapons or accept armed escort anywhere. Shells, mortars, and shrapnel are often found in Harure village or schoolyard A villager here is holding the remains of a rocket-propelled grenade in the left photo, and a teacher is holding an unexploded bullet, about a 6-inch bullet there, and a piece of shrapnel in the right photo. Hariri children refuse to let Turkey's bombardment deter their learning. These courageous teachers are determined to continue educating children. And so after school one day when we were there, teachers told CPT about the trauma children experience from continual threat and the reality of bombardment and the impact on education in these conditions. Hariri farmer Abdul Wahid invited us onto the roof of his new home. This was last spring. He told us about mortar shells damaging his new home here on the right, the upper right there. That happened just a few nights earlier. Farmers can no longer go up to the mountainside to tend crops or animals. Some village families have already abandoned their homes and fled from the war. In villages across Kurdistan, we meet village leaders, usually males, but men often defer to Kurdish political authorities and intelligence officials. So CPT and our commitment to undoing oppression means we navigate patriarchal culture and find ways to meet with women and family members. Women tell us what is, when you want to know what's happening, you find some woman in the village to talk to. Women tell us what is really going on in the terror and trauma of war. This woman, Aklima, from the Nala Valley village of Dupre, is one of our beloved truth tellers here in this region. She boldly speaks truth to power in the face of frequent scorn and threats. Aklima is a strong woman whose body and being speak as truthfully and powerfully as her words. We once asked her about, why don't you seek political office? Why don't you run for parliament? And she scoffed at us, if I sit in their chair, I would just begin to start acting like them. I don't believe she would, because she's really an amazing woman, but she has a point. Aklima embodies hospitality, humility, and honesty in the face of war. The Nala Valley lies between mountain ranges in north central Iraqi Kurdistan. This farming valley is somewhat unique in that it has Muslim and Assyrian Christian villages. They support each other as they face Turkey's warring aggression together. When bombardment was especially intense, the team accompanied villagers during the day and stayed in our friend Yusuf's guest house in Halilan, a little village, at night. This was a peaceful evening. Children were playing, women were baking bread and making dinner, men were coming in from the field or herding sheep and goats into the pens. And suddenly the evening calm was shattered by Turkish warplanes screaming overhead and bombing near the village of Azanki, just a few miles away. Kakatar was herding his cows he's in the lower left, just you can see him pointing his head and pointing there. He was herding his cows into the barn that evening when the first of 3 bombs exploded. He was the closest one to them. He ran to the house, got his family, drove into the village seeking safety. Bombing terrorizes and traumatizes children and adults and animals. Kakatar's cows gave less milk after that, and some cows miscarried after this bombing. Bombing also often damages homes and vehicles. It starts fires, burning crops and orchards and destroying their livelihood. With sadness, Kakatar told us, I've lived here all my life. I love this land and these mountains. This is all I've ever known. My wife died a few years ago, and I buried her body here on my farm. And then he choked up and was silent as tears trickled down his cheeks. It was a poignant, painful moment on a beautiful, sunny afternoon on Kakatar's farm. Kakatar knows all too well the ever-present terror of having peaceful farm life suddenly shattered by screaming warplanes dropping bombs on them. Turkey's warplanes bombed this village of Zuka up, and this is actually up near the Iranian border, but they bombed here 24 times in less than 24 hours. One time, all 20 families fled down the mountain, leaving belongings and animals behind. They found shelter in these tents in a valley along the river far from home. village matriarch Per Aish. Per means auntie in Kurdish, and so it's a designation of respect for her. She invited us into her tent with true Kurdish hospitality, and as we sipped tea, she quietly told us, she's the older woman there in the center by the tent flap. It's her son and daughter on either side of her there. As we sipped tea, she quietly told us about being bombed and forced to flee. We face an impossible choice, she explained, being bombed or being flooded. If we return to our village, we'll be bombed by Turkey's warplane. If we stay here, we'll be flooded by fall rains, which are already beginning. Her Aish embodies resilience and resolve on behalf of her people. Duca children went to school in 2 tents, too small to hold all the children. So the picture on the right, 2 little girls are studying at this desk with their teacher there. They and their 4 teachers are determined to keep learning even while they are all displaced here. One little girl asked, "Does somebody have a mic on? Is it interfering?" One little girl asked us, we spent a day with them here, and one little girl asked us, "Do children in America go to school in tents?" The polluted stream there by that you see also right through the village and by the school where they had now camped in tents. This polluted stream causes skin diseases and dysentery for the children. So message number 1, war is war on children. Today, war-related persecution and poverty has caused the displacement of over 100 million people for the first time in history. 40% are children. Turkey's military invades and occupies more and more of Iraqi Kurdistan. CPT documents Turkey's invasion and occupation of Kurdistan so that other agencies and embassies know what is happening. This map we made a year ago in December. Turkey's, the red area that Turkey occupies is actually further south into the Iraqi Kurdistan region and this now. Ayman Talib is a young mother who lost a leg and was badly burned by a drone strike. Mala Muhammad was badly injured and his father was killed, and most of his family members were injured also by a drone strike. We just made a video, about a 30-minute video about that. On November 29, just this last November 29, the team accompanied 9 survivors of Turkish bombing who traveled to Baghdad to meet Iraqi government officials. Ayman and Muhammad were 2 of the 9. CPT leads a coalition of groups for the End Cross-Border Bombing campaign, calling for Iraq to stop Turkey and Iran's military invasion of Iraq and oppression of Kurds. Their survivors that we accompanied on this day also called for Iraq to provide compensation for victims of war. Our second priority is with Kurds suffering oppression by a Kurdish regime. Jina, that is her Kurdish name. You'll see it always as Masa Amini, but that's her Iranian name. Her real name is Jina. Jina Masa Amini's death by Iranian police who accused the 22-year-old Kurdish woman of violating the dress code set off a mass protests across Iran and Iraq. This was this last September and continues. Kurdish women lead the way with the rallying cry, "Women, Life, Freedom." Jiyan Azadi in Kurdish is a global rallying cry, much like Black Lives Matter and others since the police murder of George Floyd. I would compare it something to that of what's happening, particularly in this region of the world. Iran's violent crackdown injures and kills many people, and many, many more are arrested and threatened. Iran also bombs Iranian Kurdish refugees in 3 camps near Koya in Iraqi Kurdistan. We went there in October to meet refugee families who had now fled from their refugee camp, were being bombed by Iran. It's all response to the killing of Jina Masa Amini. Iran accuses the camps of organizing Kurdish resistance in Iran from the refugee camps. So in October, we met several of the families, the upper right picture there, the refugee families who fled from Iran's bombing of their camps. We interviewed 2 teenage girls whose school was damaged and killed by bombs. One of them is the one sitting with the sort of blue shirt there next to the door. The other 2 are mothers with little children. But we interviewed these 2 girls, and one girl told us that her class was studying human rights when the bombing began. Kurdish women's rights leaders, Shoman, Bahar, Perween, Runak, and others who are very dear friends of ours and close to CPT, organized peaceful protests in Soleimani in solidarity with Iranian and Kurdish women. It was mostly, as this at the bottom, the 2 left pictures there. It was a mostly silent protest, holding up signs, Jin, Jian Azadi, women like freedom. But the local Kurdish police and security forces surrounded us and threw tear gas and stormed the women's peaceful rally and injured and arrested several women. Kurdish journalists face continual threats for critiquing political corruption and war. Shaban Shabani and Niaz Abdullah, here on the right, next to me there, are journalists whose lives were continually threatened. We met them here in Sherwan's home, the 4 of us from CPT, on this occasion, with his wife and 4 small children. He has 4 children under 10 present. One night, several months after this meeting, 10 armed, masked, unidentified men burst into his home and abducted Sherwan in front of his wife and children, confiscated all the phones, computers, and everything, put a hood over his head and drug him off, and he's been in prison ever since. He is falsely accused of threatening national security and organizing others for a coup against the Kurdish government. In a sham trial, almost 2 years ago in February 2021, he was sentenced to over 6 years in prison. Niaz Abdullah was the other one, another dear friend. After one arrest, we met with her in the upper left picture there, and to find out what happened and what she needed for support. And Niaz told us, when I left my mother and father's home that morning that I was arrested, I kissed their hands and told them, I love you and may never see you again. Niaz will not be silent, even knowing that any day she can be arrested or worse. Niaz called a meeting of other journalists in the bottom center there. Had about 24 journalists together and asked CPT to accompany her. So we documented and photographed this meeting with her. In mid 2021, a year and a half ago, CPT helped Niaz escape Iraqi Kurdistan and threats against her life, and she now lives in exile. On November 17th, last November, I'm happy to say Niaz received an award from the Committee to Protect Journalists. We work very closely with them. They're based in New York, but it's international. CPJ gave Niaz the 2022 International Press Freedom Award, along with 3 other journalists. Violence against journalists is a global problem encouraged by inflammatory words and violent action of political leaders in many countries, including the US. Kurdish journalist Sardash Doshman was 23 when abducted and murdered in Kurdistan. Tell you lots of stories, been with his family. Las Vegas investigative journalist Jeff Sherman was murdered last September. The infamous January 6, 2021, 18 journalists were severely assaulted and tens of thousands of dollars of camera equipment destroyed. Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abdul Aqwa was killed by Israeli occupation forces in Jenin in May. Filipino-American journalist and one of my favorite journalists in the world, next to Niaz and Sherwan, Maria Ressa lives with daily threats in her life. She was the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner. Thank God, finally a good Nobel Peace Prize, a worthy one. And she spoke of freedom of expression and press freedom as precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Ressa's new memoir is How to Stand Up to a Dictator, The Fight for Our Future. She was on a recent conversation with Jon Stewart, and she just laughingly said, I know that any day I can go to prison for the rest of my life. CPJ has documented 363 journalists currently in prison. Last year, 65 media members were killed. During the war on terror from 2003 to 22, 1,668 journalists were killed globally. 578 of those journalists were killed in Iraq and Syria, documented by Reporters Without Borders. Human rights and just peace are impossible without free press and democracy. No free press, no democracy. In 2020 and 2021, the Kurdish regime arrested 81 people from Badanan, one small region of Iraqi Kurdistan. Sherwan Sherwani was the first and the best known for opposing war, exposing corruption, criticizing oppression, and they have become political prisoners. The KRG accuses the Badanan prisoners of organizing militias, plotting a coup. They used, for one, they arrested him in his father-in-law's house. His father-in-law's grandfather had an ancient hunting rifle on the wall, and they said they arrested him in that house, and that was evidence that he was organizing a militia and accumulating weapons for war against the Kurdish government. Badanan prisoner journalist Ahmed Barushti and teacher Badal Bawari stood trial on October 21. During the trial, the accused are forced to stand in that cage there on the right. The accused have little access to defense attorneys, no defense witnesses, no cross-examination, and no evidence presented. Trials are false accusations by the prosecutor, by the Asayi security forces, lawyers, and by even the judges. Ahmed was so frustrated here, he finally just burst out, I am not the criminal, you are. He risks his life to speak truth to power. Badal was given a 1-year sentence. He had already served 15 months and unfortunately was released the next day. Ahmed was given a longer sentence and returned to prison. He was released. I can tell you stories about both of these have become very dear friends of ours. And both are released now, but under surveillance. Anwar Ayub, Carter Abbas, Masood Ali, and Sherwan Taha went on trial in October 2021. The trial was so ridiculous that the trial has a head judge and 2 other associate judges, but one of the 3 judges refused to participate in the verdicts. The sentencing was postponed for 3 weeks. The prosecutor indicated that she would dismiss the charges against Sherwan Taha, who's a very dear friend of ours. But he was not freed. He was sent back to prison. And 3 weeks later, when they were brought back to court, the prosecutor reinstated charges against Sherwan, and the judge sentenced him to 2.5 years in prison. Clearly, political pressure led to this reversal and conviction of Sherwan Taha. Family members are not allowed in courts, forced to wait outside, but consulate officials, members of parliament, just a few of us, and CPT are allowed in the courts to observe the trials. After each trial, family members and supporters gather outside the court building to protest injustice and call for azadi, freedom for the 81 Badanan prisoners. Here in the left picture, Sherwan Taha's wife came to all the trials, not just her husband. And here she's holding the sign there, imprisonment of Badanan activists is unlawful. Volunteer Kurdish lawyers in the center, the lead volunteer lawyer, about a dozen lawyers provide services, but it's under impossible conditions because they have very little access to the prisoners, can provide no cross-examination or any evidence or anything in court. They just mostly sit and listen. And here, after the courts, and the lawyer was speaking to the press, and then my teammate Cameron was speaking for CPT to the press as well. Unknown prisoners who are released to rejoin their families invite CPT to celebrate. Fortunately, we've been able to celebrate quite a number of times with families. There's a Sherwan Taha and his family, but they're bittersweet celebrations because many Bataclan prisoners are still in prison, and the ones who are free, like Sherwan Taha, live with threats and are monitored, are prevented from employment, and so on. So we celebrated with Sherwan and Joanne Taha family on April 20, 2022. Sherwan's mother died of heartbreak, of grief, while Sherwan was in prison. She had a heart attack, but she was so grief, she literally died overnight, triggered by that heart attack. Sherwan was not allowed to even know his mother had died while he was in prison for several months. Sherwan has dedicated his life to Kurdish and global education. He's been in the UK and the US doing global education, and now he's unemployable and lives under constant threat and fear of being rearrested. I wrote a support letter for him with the team support last fall to help them leave Kurdistan. As he said to us, it's so much stress, I can't find work. We can't live with this daily threat and stress. Bidar Zabari, another journalist and Bataclan prisoner, refuses to be silenced. He has a 6-year sentence, still in prison. Prisoners are not allowed pen or papers, so he improvised. He made a pen from the metal tab of his pants zipper and took a toothbrush handle, a cigarette lighter, and melted the plastic to the handle, and the metal tip actually became a little pen. He could actually write on it. Took a cigarette package, unfolded it, and wrote on the inside. That the picture on the right is this message to Kurdistan and the world. This is what he wrote, just the beginning and end. A courageous greeting from an isolated prison to an oppressed nation under the rule of tyrannical authority. They distort the truth with lies and false accusations, but the truth will continue on its path. And then he concluded, we bow and show our respect to any person around the world who has supported us. Our spouse, thank you very much. Bidar then had these messages that he wrote on cigarette paper smuggled out of the prison. He's still in prison. After Slimane Musa, another Bataclan prisoner's trial, this young, on the lower left there, this young woman, she's about 15, and her was Slimane Musa's daughter, and her young brother and sister, and she came up to us immediately after we came out of the trial, with there's tears running down her cheek and thanking us for supporting her father and family. Slimane was released in late 2021, a few weeks after his trial. We visited in their home several times, the upper right picture. His daughter there is in the gold sweater, again with tears. She's very articulate young woman, shared the trauma her family and father have gone through, and told us that she's dedicating her life to work for human rights after what has happened to her father. Slimane Musa was a revered teacher, a headmaster of a school who focused on teaching children to make good moral decisions and become responsible citizens. He too is falsely accused of plotting to overthrow the Kurdish regime and lost the possibility of teaching again and lives under threat and surveillance. The town of Shalaze is oppressed by both war and political oppression. Turkey has a military base in Shalaze, warplanes, drones, and helicopter gunships fly overhead. Also, the Kurdish regime arrested 6 young men in Shalaze for protesting Kurdish regime. We met with all six Shalaze families who told us that living in this town is now like a prison for them. People no longer can go to the mountains to farm, gather nuts, to fish, hike, or picnic. Turkey is waging war on them while their sons and brothers are in prison. A week ago, 5 of the 6 were freed, and a few days ago, our team went to celebrate with these families that we had met with during this last spring. In June, we had our first delegation in nearly 2 years prior to the COVID pandemic. 2 Kurdish women's rights activists came to CPT to speak to our delegation, both dear friends of ours too. Bataclan is a dedicated human rights activist and was the only woman of the 81 Bataclan prisoners. Yerevan was threatened and tortured and held in solitary confinement. Finally, she was released last May and came to visit us right away. Yerevan faces ongoing threats, yet courageously declares, if we know who we are and what we are supposed to be and do and dare to do it, nothing is impossible. I will not be silent or stop confronting oppression. Arlene, the other woman there, is a Kurdish women's rights activist and longtime CPT partner and friend. The CPT IK team also builds relationship with consulates in Iraqi Kurdistan. CPT's solidarity with Badunan prisoners has transformed our diplomatic partnerships. Now embassies contact CPT for documentation of human rights violations in Iraqi Kurdistan. The photo on the left, the Canadian consulate hosted a diplomatic roundtable with about 12 consulates, including the US, and then invited Bilal Bawari, standing in the center with the gray suit and dark shirt and gray tie there, was invited to testify about his imprisonment and human rights violation. And then Jawan Taha is sitting in the lower left, the wife of Sherlin Taha. So they and CPT were invited to share with this diplomatic roundtable about what was happening to Badunan prisoners. Another significant breakthrough in the picture on the right came 2 years ago. This was one of the very direct and immediate changes with the change in US presidents. Suze Alanchani is a new political officer in the US consulate in Erbil. If you're interested, I can tell more stories about the US consulate in the following conversation. Zaki Mohammed Shalabi was a Kurdish refugee from Turkey and owner of the Deniz restaurant in Suleimani, one of our favorite restaurants. We go here often. My last meal in a Kurdish restaurant on Friday before I left Sunday morning in November, was at this Deniz restaurant. In May, we had been there several times in the spring, but in May, Zaki was outside the Deniz talking when two guys on motorcycles rode by and the passenger shot and killed him. Turkish Secret Service is suspected of orchestrating Zaki's killing, but of course there are no arrests and nothing is done about it. Dr. Choman Hardy is another beloved CPT friend, the woman in the back there. She's an amazing academic, artist, and activist who is a leading women's rights activist, authority on genocide, a poet, and founder and director of the Center for Gender and Development Studies at American University in Iraq, Suleimani. Dr. Choman joined my teammate Cameron and me for breakfast just before I left the team in November. Aisha was heartbroken when the judge sentenced her father, Badunan prisoner Shivan Saeed, to 6 years in prison. He's still in prison. The artist Mohammed Ismail drew this portrait watching Aishan's tears and called it Aishan's tears. And then he gave it, after the trial, he gave it to the judge with a message. This portrait of Aishan I give as a gift under the condition that you hang it on your wall to remember what brought tears to this child's eyes. Political oppression like war oppresses children whose fathers are taken from them. The tragic truth cannot be dismissed as something that they do over there, but not here. Countless children lose their fathers to prison as well as war in the US. The US is incarceration nation with the highest rate of imprisonment in the industrialized world. Overwhelmingly racialized oppression against Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The United States has 5% of the world's population with 25% of the world's prisoners. Our granddaughters, Olivia and Soren, create something for me to take along to CPT every time I go. Olivia was 9 when she came to me, and she was staying with us a few days, and she quietly said, "Grandpa, do you know that Einstein said the world is not destroyed by evil? The world is destroyed by those who watch and simply do nothing." And then we talked about that a bit, and then she went, sat at my desk and drew this card for me that I have taken along to Kurdistan ever since. Our children and grandchildren's future is deeply connected to the future of Kurdish and Iraqi children and grandchildren and all children and grandchildren of the world. My favorite t-shirt is, I'm not disturbing the peace, I'm disturbing the war. And I really like the blue World Beyond War t-shirt. The first casualty of war is truth. The rest are mostly civilian. We can talk about that too. So message number 2, war is a lie. Our country lied our way into endless war, lies our way throughout endless war, and lies about ending war. In stark contrast to the predicted slam dunk victory deposing Saddam 2 decades ago and wanting US-centric democracies rippling across Iraq and the Middle East, we are mired in endless war. Here's what I'd like you to remember. War we can't win, can't lose, can't stay, can't leave. The definition of endless war. 1 million people have been killed in the war on terror, plus millions more injured, displaced, impoverished, and traumatized forever. There are many devastating consequences of our endless war in Iraq. Among them are the rise of ISIS in Iraq, where organized terrorism network did not exist, the growing military and political influence of Iran in Iraq, plus Russia and China's growing influence. China is currently building 1,000 schools in Iraq. And Iraq is essentially at least a dysfunctional, if not a failed state. The corruption and billions of dollars disappearing, it's a disastrous state now, rather than this great democracy, slam dunk. And then for some of us, the devastation for Christians in Iraq. In 2003, 20 years ago, there were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Today, there are 150,000. So I ask you, just imagine this question. If we spent $20 trillion, as we have in war, 20 years, and 20 million people building just peace rather than just war, waging just war, do we really think it would make a massive difference? Let me offer, in closing, a prophetic word from Muhammad and Jesus. This Muhammad is not Prophet Muhammad, but my dear teammate Muhammad. We were having lunch here on the Air Force project that we're working with in a Kurdish restaurant. Muhammad is on the right there. Our beloved Kurdish teammate Muhammad introduced Kurdish history to our delegation last June, and he took an hour to draw on a flip chart Kurdistan and explain the history and the politics. And then at the end, he drew a red circle around Iraqi Kurdistan on the flip chart, and he said, this is a quote, "What is needed in Kurdistan is a growing, interconnected, nonviolent movement of people across the land to build a just peace with human rights for everyone." And Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are the war makers." CPT welcomes you to be supportive partners in various ways. I could send this stuff out and the links to this. I do a blog or just voices and views. I'm going to continue it, even though I'm not going back on the team in the same way. I'm going to continue something. If you want to be on my mailing list, I'd be happy to include you in that. So, Source Boss, thank you in Kurdish. I welcome your reflections and questions. So I'll stop share and see. Okay. And I do really welcome I certainly welcome questions, but even more just sort of what's on your heart. What did you hear? What do you see? This is an area of the world that it doesn't get a lot of mainstream media press and so on. So share with me whatever you want.
Well, thanks so much for your presentation, Weldon.
Oh,
I am really struck.
Delicious. Well, you can just keep them. Give them. I'm sorry.
I'm really struck by this new information to me that the oppression that these activists seem to be facing is from the government that's supposed to be representing them, and not from the Turks who are bombing them or the Iranians who are threatening them from over the border. This is much more informative detail I've got from anything in our press.
Yes.
And What's your explanation for this? Why is it the Turks, the Kurds, who were Kurdish rulers, who were oppressing their own people this way?
Well, it's tied to a lot of things. There's several ways. Let me think about that. I first answer this way. On the one hand, I would say Kurdish people were incredibly resilient and resourceful and capable people. They could have one of the best governments in the world. On the other hand, the people in power do just like so many other people in power. So I say, imagine it in the US this way. But the primary reason is the Barzani family has been in power for a very long time. The Barzani man who began it all, who was the prime minister, is dead, but his son's now in power. That family controls and rules. So in the US, imagine, pardon me, I'm going to use real names, Donald Trump being reelected, one way or another getting into power, and then his family being in power for the next 30, 40 years. That's what's happening in Kurdistan. Asayish, the security force, has ultimate power. They function as sort of like the combination of CIA, FBI, National Security Forces, Secret Service, everything rolled into one. But their allegiance is to a party. There are two primary parties. The KDP's in power, the Barzani family, the Talabani family, the other leading Kurdish power enemy is PUK. Then there are other minority parties, you don't want to be a part of that. But that intelligence network called Asayish works for the party. So they have the power to arrest and do all these things in that region. And the KDP control most of the country and the major offices and are in power and have been for a very long time. And they go on doing what powers do. Is anything that in any way critiques, confronts, challenges, or raises questions about that is the enemy and will be destroyed.
Was there ever a time when there was a country called Kurdistan?
No, in the fall of 2019, while I was there was in Iraqi Kurdistan. In Iraqi Kurdistan, it has by far the most freedom of any of the FoR nation region. They had a referendum, and 90-some% passed a referendum to become an independent country. Well, that got Iraq, and with U.S. support, and closed down their airports, shut down everything, and so none of the controlling nations around, not only in Iraq, but particularly Turkey is the most dominant one, but Iran and Syria, the Assad regime, none of them want Kurds to have their own power, their own nation. Nobody wants to give it up. And there are lots of political reasons. One very practical reason is how much of the oil is in the Kurdish region. And nobody wants to, Iraq doesn't want to give up that in control of that oil. So all of those dynamics and a long, long history of oppression and displacement and genocide and so many factors.
Do the powers, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, get tax money from the Kurds?
Well, they do yes, certainly in their countries.
If they live in there. What is U.S. policy about our relationship to the Kurds in each of those 4 countries?
The general policy has been that we sort of hail the Kurds as pretty good people, but will undermine them in every way, will not give them support and power. The worst time came in the fall of 2019 when I was there, when the US actually sort of secretly worked with the Kurds to defeat ISIS in Syria, in northern Syria there, and to take back ISIS control is enormously difficult task. And they had US military secretly sort of helping train and guide them. But then Trump came along and Turkey said, Turkey has always said, we're going to invade and take over that territory anyway. And Trump gave them carte blanche freedom to do that. It was devastating. I tell you stories about that because anything that happens in any of those 4 regions, the Kurds, impacts all the other regions because everybody has family and connections. So it doesn't matter if it's in Turkey or Iran or Syria. Kurds in Iraq know and are connected to them, and they feel it because it's against their people. So the short answer, what Kurds have learned to know is that they can't trust the US because in the end, they'll always, in some moments, they'll sound like supporters, but when push comes in the geopolitics of things, they'll betray Kurds in a heartbeat.
What is the effect of China building 1,000 schools in Iraq?
Well, the effect is, I mean, I don't know because that's in Iraq where I can't go. I've been in Iraq, but it is what I would say, how I understand China is they know that economic, not military aid is what's going to change people. And so they're very good at doing that in a lot of places, and they see an opportunity to, it's something they can do quite readily. And a lot of Iraqis going to school will make a difference and they'll be beholden to China. So that's how they get connected in an economic connection. Iran's the one with the political and military influence, which is an irony in the US role. In the 80s, of course, Iran and Iraq were in a brutal, brutal war that killed so many people. It was and now Iran's influence in Iraq is enormous. Far more than, it's far more than US influence, So if you look at how we started the war and what we did,
backfired.
They're almost a dysfunctional state. There's so much wrong going on there. Iran's influence grew, terrorist influence. There are still terrorists everywhere. They don't control land. They're not in the same way, but they're hiding and waiting. They're around. There is no such thing as defeating ISIS or terrorists. It's people who resent US occupation or other infiltration.
So I just wondered, are there American oil companies prospecting or drilling in Kurdistan?
We started working with oil drilling and gas drilling some years ago, and then we had to give it up. I was sort of sorry for that because that's what he started in 2017 to do. So I haven't been able to do the research and investigate. Yes, because of the complication of the international oil companies, the oil company influence comes from the US, the UK, possibly Canada, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, United Arab Emirates. And so most places have sort of an intersection of who owns and who controls what and so on, but most of the control is sort of outside British control.
Do the Kurds have a congenial relationship with Syrians, with Iraqi, with Iranians, or with Turks? Do they speak the same language?
No, the languages are very different. So a little bit about languages. I did not learn enough Kurdish. In 2017 and 2018, I went back and forth from the Kurdistan team to the Palestine team to the Kurdistan team to the Palestine team to the Kurdistan team. So I was going from Arabic to Kurdish. In Kurdistan, there are two major languages in Iraqi Kurdistan. In our area, it's surrounding in the dominant area of the KDP party speaks Kurmanji, but then there are other minor. There's a little different version of Kurdish in Harami in Iran. So most people who are educated can sort of navigate all of that. We get to places speaking people. Half of our team is Kurdish, and we get to places where a Kurdish teammate can hardly understand what's being said. So that's sort of all going on around the area, and different regions speak differently and have different dialects. And a little bit like in the US, the difference between New England and the Deep South and the West and the Midwest and so on. So that's always a factor in communication that we have to navigate, find translators. And hey, should we do what was your other question with that that you asked first, I think?
Do the Kurds essentially get along with the dominant culture in each of the four countries?
There are two answers. One answer is the Kurds are remarkable at getting along with everybody, of just knowing how to navigate the web. And yes, they do, but there are a lot of tensions as well in all of those places. So it's one of the reasons I noted in the Nala Valley, where there are both Assyrian Christian villages and Kurdish and Kurdish Muslim villages, and their work together. That's fairly unusual. Usually, for the most part, it's sort of live and let live. They get along with each other or do what they have to do, and so. But then when political tensions rise, when other things happen, it exacerbates all of those long tensions and differences between people. So, so one reality is Kurds feel very discriminated against, even in Iraqi Kurdistan, but a lot of Kurds are very discriminatory against Iraqi Arabs. So, yeah, discrimination is a huge, continual tension and reality.
Are Kurds mostly Muslim?
Yes, mostly Sunni Muslim. In our neighborhood where we live, there's a very large Shia mosque. And they get along quite well. There's never any tension around that. Kurds are unusual Muslims in being, on the one hand, very, very devout Muslim, but it's rare to be a Kurd and be a fanatical Muslim. There's a sense in which they're both devout Muslim and much more secular than a lot of the Middle East Arab world is. The Arab Muslim world.
Was there any kind of something in the history of the Kurdish people that rendered them discriminated against and denied, their own country?
Yes, but I'm sorry to say that I never quite learned the Kurdish history well enough. I have a very good Kurdish history book, and we're always so busy. It's just, so I don't. It's hard for me to speak to that except very generally, saying that the ethnic, political, cultural, language dynamics always come into play in that region of the world. And of course, Iraq was carved out 100 years ago, mostly by the Great Britain, UK, and what was the, I can't even say the name of the Sykes-Picot Act of the 1920s. So, and that sort of created artificial boundaries that for what Iraq actually is, and including British people. So there's always been a tension and difficulty, and I don't know why they have not been able to.
Okay.
They've had been in various battles and wars and lost a lot of people over the centuries around those issues, but have never quite made it happen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this very informative session. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you so much for being here and all that you all do. I know you're a very sympathetic audience. So you can,
Louise, you're still unmuted. Did you have a question?
I did at one time, but it's sort of been answered, so I'll just pass for now. Thanks.
And somebody just labeled call-in user 1 has a hand raised. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, this is Michael Brunson. And I also very much appreciate tonight's presentation. And I didn't hear the answer to one of the early questions, or I didn't hear it very clearly. The speaker said that the security forces are aligned with or are controlled by political parties. And he said that there are two main political parties in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the ruling party is controlled by the Barzani, I think he said, family. And then he mentioned the Talabani family. I didn't quite. Are the Talabani family and the Barzani family in the same party together, or is the Talabani family in the second largest party and therefore somewhat in opposition to the largest party?
And thank you. Very good question and clarification. Yes, that's very important. The Talabani family is the founding family leading the PUK, the opposition party. At this point, most of the time, they're very cordial, and the two of them work out things to control Iraqi Kurdistan and keep out the minority parties who are trying to create a different kind of government in Kurdistan, and none of them sometimes are coalitions of all of those. This fall, there's been increasing tensions and actually some car bombings and so on between the Asaish groups of each other's vehicles. So you never know quite what's going to happen and how it's going to erupt and who else it's going to impact, because a lot of crazy things happen. But most of the time, PDK and PUK more or less work together and keep control of Iraqi Kurdistan.
And what did you say were the initials of those two parties?
The UK and, well, the PDK, but actually it goes by two different, KDP. Some people to keep it easier to distinguish. It's the Kurdish language and translation in the English. That's the problem. So KDP is the Barzani family that's in control, has been for a long time. PUK is the Talabani family. And there's been a Talabani in the Iraqi government. So in Iraq, the prime minister needs to be Shia. The foreign minister needs to be Sunni, and the president of Iraq needs to be Kurdish. So sometimes comes from the PUK and sometimes from the KDP party. Does that help answer your question?
A little bit, at least. Yes,
believe me, when
you had another hour to lecture on it, it would probably help even more.
Yeah, well, and even just to put that really in perspective, it took me 2 years of being there half time just to try to keep things straight about who's doing what and how does this work. And it still is confusing for many Kurdish people. and for me. So yeah, it's a fairly complex political situation.
So I do have a question now, Weldon, and
Yes,
that's
thank you.
what's the future for this section of the world?
Well, it's a difficult future. It's going to go on like it is. In one way, it looks like it's not going anywhere. It's much of the time it's not getting worse, and then terrible things happen, and it looks immediately worse. It's not going to be. There's not going to be an independent Kurdistan anytime in the foreseeable future. They will navigate their way politically and militarily. They do have their own military, Peshmerga, and so on as best they can. I think indefinitely not very much is going to change. They have brilliant people, some incredibly gifted leaders who would be great political leaders, but they'll never get close to anywhere in power in the current political system. So it's hard to say. It's not much that's going to change. The work will go on. CPT's hopes can keep going on. The CPT in the past 2 years, we've had by far the biggest impact and the highest profile we've ever had. Everybody in Iraq knows us. Politically, they know us. That's why embassies and everyone is turning to CPT for documentation and what's happening, because we go places nobody else will go with people, or the things I just shared with you. So we've seen far more than most political leaders ever will see.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Weldon, you mentioned meeting with the U.S. consular officials.
Yeah.
What kind of influence have you had there?
Well, the good thing, and Suzanne has been a marvelous connection and help. Very, very concerned with human rights. So what they want from us, in order to follow diplomatic channels and be a consulate, they're very much connected to the embassy in Baghdad, the U.S. embassy, and under that, the ambassador. But they want hard documentation of human rights violations. And Suzanne is working very, very hard on how to use that information for her diplomatic channel. So she's really eager. We have lots of contact with her. So it's the best we've ever had with anyone in the embassy. So we're really, really pleased about that. It's a little bit ironic, just a word about that, because one of the reasons they need documentation is they live in Erbil, which is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, and we're in Silmani, it's 3 hours away from us, in an embassy compound that's an entirely enclosed place itself. They have to get, so Suzanne herself can't get out of the embassy compound without at least a day's notice of written permission to go do something or to go. So they don't even come to the trials. Most of the other embassies, people from Germany and the European Union and a lot of the Dutch and so on, come to the trial. But they don't even, they're rarely outside the compound. So everything they do is the information they can gather. And it takes us, we've been inside several times. You have to get permission the day ahead of time. You got to get exact, precise, complete details. You go through a long process and checkpoints to get inside. Once we're inside, we should say they're very gracious to us and we're fine. But it's a strange place. So one of the things I say with people often, going back to George Bush in the beginning of where they just don't like our freedom. The most important places in the world are U.S. embassies. there you see it. What does freedom mean? We can go anywhere. I mean, like one thing I didn't talk about, there are checkpoints everywhere, and we're always navigating that, and sometimes not allowed through into a certain area at a certain time. But we go all over the country, everywhere, from border to border. People in the U.S. Embassy barely get out of the embassy compound.
Which country?
Iraqi Kurdistan.
Thank you so much, Weldon, for this illumination of an area that has been in the shadows, Lord knows, deep in the shadows. Without the CPT witness, it would still be there.
Yeah.
So I appreciate so much your coming in and speaking with us. Are there other questions from anyone? Elaine?
Yes, thank you. As Weldon knows, I've been familiar with the work of CPT for many years. But I'm getting a new appreciation hearing your presentation tonight with really how effective you've been, or the team has been there. And I wonder what you can say about the future of CPT in Iraqi Kurdistan, and kind of if you see them growing or sustaining this work, and yeah, anything light you can shed on the future of CPT in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Well, there's a very, very harsh reality going on right now, the past year. And that is that on the upside, as I said, our profile and impact is greater than ever. I think it's probably the greatest impact any CPT team has ever had anywhere in terms of how we're known and who turns to us for documentation and so on. So, and the work is growing because the situation is so bad. But the money is diminishing. We're again, this year, in the fall, we spent way too much time decreasing a budget from $67,000 to $59,000 or something. We work on nothing doing this work because so eventually we'll come to cutting out a CPT team. We have teams in Colombia, in Palestine, on Lesbos Island, the Aegean Migrant Solidarity Team, and then the Turtle Island Solidarity Network in the US and Canada. That's a volunteer. We used to have an active team, but now that's volunteer because we had cut out that team. That's the great dilemma, is the work grows and we have to do it on less money. So it's very hard. It means we need 6 people all the time from a pool of 12 people to do this work. And right now we have 3 Kurdish team members, and that's it, working. And we don't know who or when or how we're getting other team. So this fall, for a while, we were working with, often with 3 of us, sometimes with 4 of us. It's harder than being in the church. than being a pastor where the work never ends. That's the reality. Is the needs grow, the work grows, the requests come, but we have to stay very focused on our 2 major areas with Turkey and Iran's bombardment and with political oppression in the country, and because we get requests. We do some in LGBTQ, other women's oppression. We can't do it. We don't have the time and the resources to do it. We can't do everything. So we have to say no to a lot of really serious urgent, dire requests where people are.
So do you think
And
this,
great oppression.
this shortage of funding is that a trend across human rights organizations, or is it, I guess I
Yeah.
have to wonder if CPT is maybe just not very well known and, you know, not blowing your horn loud enough, I guess, for people to realize the valuable work that's being done to support it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would say three things. There's a massive trend. I mean, speak of this mostly in the U.S. context, but I think it's much more global than that. There's an enormous competition for dollars. There's so many groups doing so many things. That's one major factor. The pandemic has had a huge impact. I think people are being more careful with money and uncertain about what's happening, and then inflation comes along, and we're at a time when it seems like people are being more careful about who and where they give. That's one. Explicit to CPT, this is the way I would say it. We're 36 years into CPT now, and it grew up with my generation, the people I was around from the beginning. I know the people who began it and everything. People like you are the contributors to CPT. 80% of that money comes from individuals, and about 75% from individual, 15% from churches or peace groups, and then less than 10% from a variety of other places. And our generation is retired and dying. The CPT supporters for 36 years are not living or don't have the resources to contribute. And that the CPT team members are mostly 20-something. We get the best of the world. They're phenomenal. I could talk to the team members for hours. I've worked with phenomenal people, mostly in their 20s. I'm 77. I'm 3 times as old as most of the people I work with. But they're not people with money. And they come from all over the world in places without money. So we're very, very global people, and the financial base is disappearing. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
So, Mary, I'll let you tell me what's the parameters are here.
Well, I would just urge you to, as Elaine kind of said, toot your horn louder. I do think there are younger people who are progressive. It's just the challenge is how many requests for money people are getting.
Exactly.
The internet has changed that so much.
Yes.
But on the other hand, if you can get somebody like World Channel is wonderful. That's a Channel 9 channel. Here in Seattle, it's called Channel 9.4 World Channel. And they have many documentaries on many issues and groups, and from all over the world that are in the shadows and that they bring out. And so really great documentaries. So since you do one of the great things about this generation is that they film everything.
That's
and
right.
so good at creating documentaries. So I would say that getting access to those people who make good documentaries and getting the footage to them and that sort of thing can bring attention. But yeah, the demands for attention have definitely just exploded. There's no question about that. But as to our generation being the ones that don't have money, it's because the communication to the younger generations isn't somehow getting to them the way that it needs to. So we're still pretty much relying on older forms of communication, but even I just think the documentaries that I see on World Channel do manage to break through much more than any other place that I know of that's free, that's not, and that isn't quite as insane as just having to dig it out of the larger internet. But anyway, I just wonder, are there other comments or questions from anyone else here for our speaker? Thank you for joining us, Weldon. We really appreciate this presentation. And for those of you who may have joined late, Jonathan will be, he did record this, so it will be available on YouTube in a day or two. And we will share it with you, Weldon, so that you can in turn share the YouTube of the presentation. Great slides, very, very clear, wonderful presentation, so thank you.
Thank you all, Source Boss. Thank you.